just imagine if you were a citizen of a state or a country and you believed that something was wrong that country was doing. Nowadays you hear people talking about child soldiers. Just imagine if you believe so strongly against having child soldiers fight for your country, but your country still did it. And you believe so strongly that you started a rebellion or started a revolt, and then you were eventually killed or hanged by your country, and you were labeled as a treason, as committing treason. And then 3 years, 4 years down the road, the country goes back on what they said and says, oh, well, that's actually against what we believe in. So the fact that you started a revolt when the country was okay with child soldiers, does that mean that you should be looked at negatively because that's what the country believed in at that time? Or because the country eventually changed its mind, should you be looked at as a positive role model or a martyr for that cause? So that's what we're going to talk about today. What we're talking about is John Brown and his deal, or his fight against slavery. So I'm going to give you a little background about John Brown, where the nation was at that time. We're going to talk about John Brown's motives, and then we're going to talk about the raid on Harper's Ferry a little bit, which was his signature, and what his signature raid and what he's most well known for, and what eventually cost him his life. And then the aftermath of Harper's Ferry, and then we're going to decide as to whether or not John Brown should be remembered as a martyr or a murderer. So John Brown, he was born in Connecticut and he was raised in Ohio. He was raised in a anti-slavery family, so obviously Connecticut and Ohio are the north. So he was raised with the atmosphere and the mindset that slavery is not a good thing at all. Which was the contrary belief down in the South, because they needed it. They didn't need it for their plantations, but that's what they said. And then so let's see. So his younger years, he was a businessman, but then he attended a anti-slavery abolitionist meeting in Cleveland in 1837 that changed his life. And he was 37 at that time. In 1848, he was already making plans to overthrow the government. And then, let's see, in the 50s, he moved to Kansas and participated in what was known as Bleeding Kansas. It was nonviolent slavery protests until he came, and he led people. He led about 50 men, I think, and he killed five people who were advocating for slavery. So he turned Bleeding Kansas into a violent battle, I guess, but not really a battle because it was just isolated event. So then, after that, he left Bleeding Kansas because most of the people that were there were against taking action and violence. And he was quoted as saying, "These men are all talk. We need action." So he was all about, you can't just solve this with talk. You must take action and stand for what you believe in. So then after Bleeding Kansas, he took a group of men who were loyal to him, and he moved to Maryland, and he rented out a farm, and he started training his men to prepare to raid Harper's Ferry. So in the United States at that time, James Buchanan was president, Oregon became the 33rd state, and the Pikes Peak Gold Rush was beginning in Colorado. So a lot of the focus was on expanding west. It wasn't as much on the problems on the East Coast and the problems in the South. There was a lot of focus just on, we're becoming this great nation, we're expanding. So the focus had kind of been lost on how the problem of slavery and how inhumane it was. So yes. So now we're going to go to John Brown's motives. I'm going to give you a quote that from him that kind of sums up where he was coming from. So he says, "Whereas slavery, throughout its entire existence in the United States, is none other than the most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one portion of its citizens against another portion, the only conditions of which are perpetual imprisonment and hopeless servitude, or of absolute extermination in the utter disregard and violation of those eternal and self-evident truths set forth in the Declaration of Independence. So you all know the Declaration of Independence. So he believed in that, and he believed that that's what we stood for. And obviously slavery was not all men are created equal. That's not how they were treating it, but he believed in that. And so the raid, it was October 16th to 17th, 1859, which was 2 years before the Civil War started in '61. So John Brown, he was at the farm outside of Maryland. He and his group of men of about 20 people, they started taking the town. They let a train go by. They had originally stopped it, but they let it go by, which eventually caused the raid to go bad, because the train went up to Washington and warned Marines in Washington, D.C. of the raid, and then eventually sent Marines down to stop the raid. So he was trying to take, he was robbing an arsenal and taking all the weapons and stuff, and he was going to arm slaves so that they could stage their own revolt. But through the raid, 8 people died, or 8 to 11 people died, and they were some of them were his own men, and some of them were innocent civilians. And so the controversy is that did these people deserve to die? Did this town that was at this time in the nation's at this time, like, they weren't expecting raids, they weren't expecting violence. It wasn't a violent time in America. So did these people really deserve to have this raid brought upon them? And so with that in mind, with the fact that 11 people died during the raid, that's the main criticism of John Brown's actions. Because everyone knows that his reasoning for freeing slaves was good, but how he went about it was wrong. That's the argument. But so the aftermath of John Brown's raid. So I have one more quote from him that was given before he was sentenced to die after he was captured. So he says, "Now, if it deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in the slave country, whose rights are disregarded by the wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." So in this quote, John Brown shows that he was willing to die for what he believed in. Okay? 600, eventually, 2 years later during the Civil War, 620,000 Americans took up arms against each other and died. Well, more than that took up arms, but 620,000 died. So that shows that violence must have taken place in order to change slavery. It couldn't have been a passive change. That violence and death had to happen. So if the 10 people that died at Harper's Ferry that day, if because of that, John Brown should be, they labeled John Brown as a murderer, but 620,000 people died, and the South were liberators, and or the North were liberators, and their actions were looked at as good. Like, how can that equate? Because John Brown's actions directly led to the Civil War, which directly led to the ending of slavery. So he, in my opinion, and in anyone's opinion who actually looks into it and looks past the 10 people that died, John Brown should be remembered as a martyr for the cause, because his actions did lead directly to the Civil War, which led to the end of slavery, and he died for what he believed in. He knew it was right. So John Brown, in my opinion, was a martyr and should not be remembered in a negative way, as many Americans do. So, thank you.